Wyoming Territory, 1878. The first hint of winter had come early to the frontier town of Pine Ridge, bringing with it the kind of bitter chill that reminded Thomas Landon that the West was never meant to be tamed, only survived. Frost etched patterns across the windows of the newly constructed town hall as he tethered his horse to the post outside, his breath forming clouds in the December air. At 26, Thomas had already lived several lifetimes by frontier standards. The Civil War had taken his father and brother, leaving him to guide his mother and sisters back to Massachusetts before he struck out west alone at 20. He'd learned quickly that forming attachments in this harsh country was a fool's errand. People died out here from disease, from violence, from the land itself. The frontier demanded solitude, and he'd adapted accordingly. "Heard they got some fancy Eastern choir director for this Christmas thing," said Gregory Miller, the blacksmith, as Thomas stamped his boots on the wooden steps of the hall. Thomas merely nodded. He hadn't come for the performance. He'd come because Sheriff Cole had asked all the ranch hands in the area to be present. Something about showing civilization was taking root in Pine Ridge. Thomas privately thought civilization and the frontier mixed about as well as oil and water, but he kept his opinions to himself. "You staying through Christmas, Landon?" Miller asked. "Just until the Barton herd is moved," Thomas replied, "then heading south for work." The blacksmith shook his head. "Always moving, you ought to put down roots sometime." Thomas didn't bother responding. Roots meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant pain. The lesson had been beaten into him by 6 years on the frontier. You survived by staying unattached, keeping your possessions light and your connections lighter. A man on horseback could outrun almost anything, whether outlaws, even his own past, but only if he traveled alone. Inside the hall, the townsfolk of Pine Ridge had gathered in their Sunday best. Women in carefully preserved dresses from back east, men with slicked hair and fresh-shaved faces. Thomas took a seat in the back row, keeping his hat on his knee and his eyes on the door. Old habits. The choir director from Boston had apparently convinced half the town to participate in some Christmas pageant. Thomas cared little for such things. Christmas had meant something once, back home with family gathered around a fire, but out here it was just another day to avoid freezing or starving. The performance began, children reciting verses from the Bible, followed by carols Thomas vaguely remembered from childhood. He was considering slipping out when she walked onto the stage. She couldn't have been more than 22, with hair the color of summer wheat and eyes that somehow caught the lamplight even from across the room. She wore a modest blue dress with white trim, nothing fancy by Eastern standards, but it complemented her fair complexion and slender frame perfectly. The choir director introduced her as Miss Beatrice Northwood, recently arrived from Chicago to teach at the new schoolhouse. When she began to sing Silent Night, her voice clear and unwavering, Thomas felt something stir within him, something he'd buried so deeply he'd forgotten its existence. For the first time in years, he remained in his seat not out of obligation but desire. The performance continued with a theatrical reading of Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Miss Northwood played the part of Belle, Scrooge's lost love. She delivered her lines with such feeling that the dusty hall seemed to fade away around her. Thomas found himself leaning forward, transfixed. Then came the scene where Belle releases Scrooge from their engagement, recognizing he has replaced her with the love of money. As she spoke of how another idol had displaced her, something extraordinary happened. Miss Northwood faltered. Her voice caught, her face froze in an expression of such raw pain that Thomas felt it like a physical blow. For 3 heartbeats, she stood completely still, her eyes fixed on some distant point. The audience shifted uncomfortably. The director whispered her next line, and in that moment Thomas saw it, not just stage fright or a forgotten line, but the unmistakable look of someone confronting a ghost of their own past. She recovered quickly, finishing the scene with composure, but Thomas couldn't forget that moment of vulnerability. He understood too well the look of someone who carried invisible wounds. Someone who, like him, had built walls against the past. The performance ended to enthusiastic applause. As people began to mill about, sampling the refreshments laid out on tables, Thomas found himself standing against the back wall, uncertain why he hadn't already left. Miss Northwood moved through the crowd, accepting compliments with gracious smiles that never quite reached her eyes. Sheriff Cole appeared at Thomas's side, a cup of punch in his weathered hand. Quite a performance, wasn't it? Miss Northwood is a fine addition to our community. She seemed affected by the role, Thomas said carefully. Cole nodded. Heard she came west after some tragedy back in Chicago, doesn't speak of it. He took a sip of punch. Speaking of newcomers, the ranchers are meeting tomorrow about those cattle rustlers hitting the northern pastures. Could use your tracking skills if you're willing. Thomas agreed, grateful for the change of subject. As the evening wound down, he prepared to leave, pulling on his coat and gloves. At the door he nearly collided with Miss Northwood, who was retrieving her own coat. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, stepping back. "No harm done," she replied, her voice musical even in ordinary speech. Up close he could see the fine details of her face, a small scar near her right temple, a dusting of freckles across her nose, and eyes of the clearest blue he'd ever seen. "Your performance was moving," he said, surprising himself. Thomas Landon didn't make small talk, especially with beautiful women. "Thank you, Mr. Landon." Thomas Landon. "Well, thank you, Mr. Landon." She smiled, and this time it touched her eyes, transforming her face. "Though I admit I nearly ruined the whole affair by forgetting my lines." "I wouldn't say that," Thomas replied. "Sometimes the most honest moments come when the script fails us." Something flickered across her expression, recognition, perhaps, that he had seen beneath her composed exterior. "Well observed, Mr. Landon," she said quietly. "Are you a regular theater-goer?" "No, ma'am, more familiar with cattle than culture." "A cowboy, then." There was no judgment in her tone, merely curiosity. "For my sins," he replied with the ghost of a smile. A call from across the room drew her attention. "I should go. The director needs help with the children. Good evening, Mr. Landon." As she walked away, Thomas felt an unfamiliar sensation, regret that a conversation had ended. Outside in the cold night air, he mounted his horse and rode back to the Barton ranch, but his thoughts remained in that warm hall with the schoolteacher whose facade had cracked just enough to reveal something familiar, something that mirrored his own carefully hidden pain. The next morning, Thomas joined the meeting at the sheriff's office. A dozen ranchers crowded the small space, their breath visible in the unheated room as they discussed the growing problem of cattle theft. "Lost 8 head last week alone," said Barton, Thomas's current employer. "Good breeding stock, too." "Same story over at Whitcomb's place," another rancher added. "Someone's hitting all the north properties." Sheriff Cole unfolded a rough map across his desk. "I need men who can track. We think they're moving the cattle through Blackwater Canyon, but it's treacherous country, especially with snow coming." "I'll go," Thomas said, studying the map. "Know that area from last spring's roundup." The meeting concluded with plans for a posse to ride out the following morning. As Thomas left the sheriff's office, his attention was caught by a commotion outside the general store across the street. A man was shouting at someone just inside the doorway, his stance aggressive despite the early hour. Without thinking, Thomas crossed the street, approaching at an angle that would put him between the man and the store entrance. As he drew closer, he saw that the recipient of the man's anger was Miss Northwood, her arms filled with packages, her expression a careful mask of composure. "You think you're too good for honest folk now that you're playing schoolmarm," the man was saying, swaying slightly. Even from several feet away, Thomas could smell the whiskey on him. "Mr. Reed, please go home and sober up," Miss Northwood replied evenly. "We can discuss whatever's bothering you another time." "Don't tell me what to do, woman. You're just like her, think you can just leave a man when it suits you." Thomas stepped forward. "Everything all right here, Miss Northwood?" Reed turned, scowling. "Mind your own business, cowboy." "Mr. Landon," Miss Northwood acknowledged, relief flashing briefly in her eyes. "Mr. Reed was just leaving." "Wasn't done talking to you," Reed growled, taking a step toward her. Thomas moved smoothly between them. "Seems the lady disagrees. Best be on your way now." For a tense moment, Reed looked ready to fight, but something in Thomas's steady gaze made him reconsider. With a final venomous look at Miss Northwood, he stalked away, muttering curses. "Thank you," she said quietly as Thomas helped gather a package she'd dropped. "Frank Reed's wife left on yesterday's stagecoach. I'm afraid he's decided to blame me for encouraging her independence." "Did you?" Thomas asked, curious despite himself. A hint of steel entered her voice. "I taught her to read better." What she did with that knowledge was her choice. Thomas handed her the package. "Need help carrying these." She studied him for a moment. Actually, yes, I'm headed to the schoolhouse. It's a bit far with all this. They walked in companionable silence through the town, frost crunching beneath their boots. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of Pine Ridge, a simple one-room building with a bell tower. The children are preparing a small Christmas exhibition, she explained as she unlocked the door. These are supplies for their projects. Inside, the schoolroom was neat but sparsely furnished. Rows of desks facing a larger teacher's desk, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, and bookshelves containing perhaps 24 volumes. Not much of a library, Thomas observed. We make do, she replied. I brought some books from Chicago, and Mrs. Peterson at the hotel donated her collection of Shakespeare. The children are particularly fond of the battles. As she arranged her packages on the desk, Thomas noticed a small photograph in a silver frame, a family group, parents with 3 children. Miss Northwood followed his gaze. My family, she said softly, taken 2 years ago. Something in her tone made Thomas look more closely at her face. You've lost them, he said, not a question but a recognition. She met his eyes, and in that moment no words were needed. They shared the language of grief. The influenza last winter, she finally said. It took them all in the span of 2 weeks. My parents, my sisters, she touched the frame gently. I came west because Chicago held too many ghosts. Thomas understood then what he had seen during her performance. The moment when Belle spoke of a love replaced, when Miss Northwood had frozen on stage. It wasn't just acting, it was memory. Loss had a way of ambushing you when you least expected it. I lost my father and brother at Gettysburg, he offered, surprising himself. He never spoke of his family. My mother and sisters moved back east to live with relatives. I haven't seen them in 6 years. By choice, she asked, at first by necessity, then by habit. He looked around the schoolroom, changing the subject. You've made a good start here. She accepted the deflection gracefully. The children deserve a proper education, even on the frontier, perhaps especially here. A comfortable silence fell between them, neither feeling the need to fill it with empty words. Finally, Thomas moved toward the door. The posse leaves at dawn to track those rustlers, he said. Might be gone several days. Be careful, Mr. Landon. That canyon can be treacherous in winter. He nodded, oddly touched by her concern. I know its moods. As he reached the door, she called after him. Will you come to the children's Christmas exhibition? It's the day after tomorrow. They would appreciate having an audience beyond parents and the usual town folk. Thomas hesitated. Attachments were dangerous, connections meant vulnerability, and yet, if we're back by then, he promised. The posse rode out before sunrise the next morning, 6 men following tracks that had been partially obscured by a light snowfall overnight. Thomas took point, his eyes catching details others missed, broken branches, disturbed snow, the occasional cattle print preserved in a sheltered spot. By midday, they'd reached the entrance to Blackwater Canyon, a narrow passage between towering rock walls that twisted for nearly 3 miles before opening into a hidden valley rarely visited except by the most experienced hunters. Tracks are fresher here, Thomas called back to the others. Can't be more than a day ahead. Sheriff Cole rode up beside him. How many, you figure? Thomas studied the trail. 3, maybe 4 men. Driving at least a dozen head. Organized operation, Cole muttered. Too organized for local troublemakers. They proceeded cautiously into the canyon, the walls rising steeply on either side, allowing only a thin strip of sky overhead. The temperature dropped as they moved deeper into shadow, their breath-forming clouds that lingered in the still air. 2 miles in, Thomas raised his hand, signaling a halt. Ahead, the canyon widened slightly into a small clearing where ancient floods had carved out a flat area beside the frozen stream. Fresh ashes in a fire pit showed where the rustlers had camped. Recent, he said quietly to Cole, last night. They can't be far then, the sheriff replied. Question is, do we push on or make camp ourselves? Light's fading fast in here. The decision was made for them when a rifle shot echoed through the canyon, the bullet striking rock inches from Thomas's head, sending fragments flying. The posse scattered for cover as more shots followed. Ambush, Cole shouted unnecessarily. From his position behind a boulder, Thomas counted at least 3 different shooting positions, 1 high on the canyon wall, 2 ahead near the far end of the clearing. The rustlers had the advantage of higher ground and preparation. For 20 minutes, gunfire echoed between the canyon walls as the posse and rustlers exchanged shots. One of the ranchers took a bullet in the arm, another had his horse shot from under him. They were pinned down with nightfall approaching. Thomas studied the canyon wall opposite his position. If he could climb it, he might be able to flank the shooter on the high ground. "Cover me," he told Cole, then darted from his shelter toward the base of the wall. Bullets kicked up dust around him as he ran, but he reached the rock face unscathed and began to climb. The stone was cold beneath his fingers, handholds treacherous with ice, but years of frontier living had made Thomas both strong and agile. Foot by foot he ascended, moving horizontally when possible to stay out of the line of fire. Finally, he pulled himself onto a narrow ledge that ran along the canyon wall. Moving carefully, he worked his way toward the rustler's position, drawing his revolver as he went. The shooter, a bearded man in a buffalo coat, was so focused on the posse below that he didn't notice Thomas's approach until it was too late. Thomas pressed the barrel of his gun against the man's neck. "Drop the rifle," he ordered quietly. The man froze, then slowly let his weapon fall to the ledge. "You're making a mistake," he growled. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "A cattle thief is who I'm dealing with," Thomas replied. "Signal your friends to surrender." The man hesitated, then gave a distinctive whistle. The shooting from below stopped. "Tell them to throw down their weapons and come out with their hands up," Thomas instructed. The rustler complied, shouting down to his companions. Two men emerged from cover, hands raised. Sheriff Cole and the others quickly moved to apprehend them. As Thomas marched his captive down a treacherous path to the canyon floor, he studied the man more carefully. His clothes were too fine for an ordinary rustler, his manner too confident. "You're right," Thomas said. "I don't know who I'm dealing with. Why don't you enlighten me?" The man smiled coldly. "Name's James Harker. Remember it because this isn't over." Thomas handed Harker over to Cole, who whistled low when he saw the prisoner. "James Harker, you're a long way from Denver." "You know him?" Thomas asked. "By reputation. Runs a gang that's been causing trouble all over Colorado. Didn't know they'd moved this far north." Cole tightened the ropes binding Harker's wrists. "This is quite a catch." They made camp in the clearing, setting a watch rotation through the night. In the morning, they found the stolen cattle gathered in a natural pen at the valley beyond the canyon, nearly 30 head from various ranches in the area. By the time they drove the recovered animals back to Pine Ridge and secured the prisoners in the town jail, it was late afternoon of the following day. Thomas was bone-weary, his body aching from the climb and the long ride home. But as he unsaddled his horse at the livery stable, he remembered his promise to Miss Northwood. The children's Christmas exhibition would be starting soon at the schoolhouse. Thomas debated with himself. He needed rest. He needed to clean up. He needed to keep his distance from the beautiful schoolteacher whose presence made him question his solitary existence. Yet 20 minutes later, he found himself walking toward the schoolhouse, having hastily washed and changed into his least worn shirt. Lantern light spilled from the windows, and the sound of children's voices raised in song greeted him as he approached. He slipped in quietly, taking a place at the back of the room where parents and townsfolk had gathered to watch the performance. The children stood in front of the schoolroom, reciting poems and singing carols they had practiced. Their faces shone with excitement and nervousness in equal measure. Miss Northwood sat at a small pump organ, accompanying their songs with gentle chords, offering encouraging smiles when a child faltered. She hadn't seen Thomas enter, and he took the opportunity to observe her unnoticed. Her hair was arranged simply, a few loose tendrils framing her face. Her dress was forest green, modest but becoming. But it was her expression that captivated him, a genuine warmth as she watched her students perform, pride evident in every glance. After the final carol, the children presented small handmade gifts to their parents, paper ornaments, carved wooden figures, sachets of pine needles. The room filled with exclamations of delight and the happy chaos of families gathering their belongings to depart. As the crowd thinned, Miss Northwood finally spotted Thomas by the door. Her face brightened with surprise and what might have been pleasure. "Mr. Landon," she said, approaching him, "you came." "I promised," he replied simply. "I heard about the success with the rustlers. The whole town's talking about your climb up the canyon wall." Thomas shrugged uncomfortably. "Just did what was needed." Mother Crawford is hosting a small gathering at the boarding house to celebrate Christmas Eve, she said. Nothing fancy, just coffee and cake. Would you consider coming? The invitation caught him off guard. His instinct was to refuse, to retreat to the solitude that had protected him for so long. But something in her eyes, a hope, perhaps, or a recognition of kindred loneliness, made him hesitate. I'm not much for social gatherings, he began. Neither am I, truthfully, she confessed. But it's Christmas, and I find it unbearable to be alone with my thoughts at Christmas. Her honesty disarmed him. What time? Her smile was worth the discomfort he knew he'd feel among strangers. 7 o'clock, it's the yellow house on Spruce Street. Thomas arrived at the boarding house exactly at 7, a bottle of decent whiskey in hand, his contribution to the festivities. Mother Crawford, a plump widow who had turned her large home into lodging for respectable single women and travelers, welcomed him effusively. Mr. Landon, we've heard so much about your heroics. Come in, come in. The parlor was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, a small tree adorned with paper ornaments standing in the corner. A dozen or so people were already present, the doctor and his wife, the telegraph operator, 2 young women who worked at the general store, and a few others Thomas recognized by sight but not name. Miss Northwood stood near the fireplace, conversing with the minister's wife. She wore the same green dress from earlier, but had added a cameo brooch at her throat. When she saw Thomas, she excused herself and came to greet him. You actually came, she said with a smile that suggested she'd half expected him to change his mind. Promised this time too, he replied, awkwardly holding out the whiskey. Wasn't sure what to bring. Perfect for warming the coffee, she said, taking the bottle. Come meet everyone properly. To Thomas's surprise, the evening passed pleasantly. The gathering was informal, the conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. No one asked intrusive questions about his past, content to discuss present concerns, the weather, local news, plans for the new year. Miss Northwood, Beatrice, as she insisted he call her after the second cup of whiskey-laced coffee, remained often by his side, her presence somehow making the social interactions less taxing. As the evening grew late, someone suggested carols. Mother Crawford took her place at the upright piano in the corner, and the guests gathered around. Thomas hung back, content to listen rather than participate. They sang the familiar Christmas songs, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, Joy to the World, O Come All Ye Faithful. Thomas found himself watching Beatrice, how the firelight caught the gold in her hair, how her clear voice rose above the others. She sang with the same emotion he'd witnessed at the Christmas pageant, but without the moment of frozen pain. When Mother Crawford struck the opening chords of Silent Night, however, something changed. Beatrice's voice faltered, then stopped altogether. Her face grew pale, and she quietly stepped back from the group, moving toward the hallway. Thomas followed her, concerned. He found her in the darkened dining room, standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered street. Beatrice, he said softly. She turned, and he saw tears on her cheeks, silver in the moonlight filtering through the window. I'm sorry, she said, hastily wiping them away. It was my youngest sister's favorite carol. We sang it together every Christmas Eve. She had the sweetest voice, even at 9. Thomas moved to stand beside her at the window. No need to apologize for grief. It ambushes me at the strangest moments, she admitted. I'll be fine for days, weeks even, and then something small, a song, a child's laugh that sounds like Emily's, brings it all rushing back. Grief doesn't follow rules, Thomas said quietly. Doesn't keep to a schedule. She looked at him curiously. You speak from experience. He nodded, finding himself willing to share what he normally kept locked away. After Gettysburg, I couldn't bear to hear a military drum. Even years later, the sound would bring it all back, the noise, the smoke, my brother's face as he fell. Does it ever get easier? Not easier, different, he considered his words carefully. At first, grief is like a river in flood, overwhelming everything. Later, it carves a channel through your life, still there but contained. You learn to live alongside it. She was silent for a long moment. That's the most honest answer anyone has given me, she finally said. Everyone else says time heals all wounds, as though grief has an expiration date. Some wounds don't heal, Thomas replied. They just become part of who you are. In the parlor, the carol ended and another began. Neither of them moved to rejoin the gathering. "Is that why you keep moving?" she asked. "To outrun the river." The question struck uncomfortably close to truth. "Partly," he admitted. "Mostly I learned that attachments are dangerous out here. The frontier takes everything eventually." "So you give up nothing to avoid losing everything." Her insight was gentle but penetrating. Before he could respond, Mother Crawford appeared in the doorway. "There you are, we're serving cake and more coffee. Come join us." They returned to the gathering, the moment of intimacy broken but not forgotten. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Thomas found himself reluctant to leave. Beatrice walked with him to the door. "Thank you for coming," she said. "It meant more than you know." "I enjoyed it," he replied, surprising himself with the truth of it. "Will you be at the Christmas service tomorrow?" she asked. Thomas hesitated. Church wasn't part of his frontier existence. "I'm not much for services." "Neither am I anymore," she confessed, "but I promised the minister I'd sing." It would be nice to see a friendly face in the congregation. Put that way, he couldn't refuse. "What time?" 10 o'clock. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting lazily in the glow of the porch lantern. Thomas pulled his hat lower against the chill. "Merry Christmas, Thomas," Beatrice said softly. "Merry Christmas, Beatrice." As he walked back to his rented room above the livery stable, Thomas found his thoughts in unusual turmoil. The frontier had taught him that survival meant isolation, that connections were weaknesses waiting to be exploited by the harsh realities of Western life. Yet tonight, for the first time in years, he'd felt something other than the grim determination that had carried him through each day. He'd felt alive. The Christmas service the next morning found the small church filled to capacity. Thomas sat in the last pew, uncomfortable in his best clothes, aware of curious glances from regular churchgoers surprised by his presence. When Beatrice rose to sing, "O Holy Night," however, he forgot his discomfort, entranced by the pure emotion in her voice as it filled the simple wooden structure. Afterward, as people gathered on the church steps to exchange greetings, Sheriff Cole approached Thomas. "Need a word," he said quietly, "in private." They moved away from the crowd toward the sheriff's office across the street. "Got a telegram from Denver yesterday," Cole explained, "about Harker and his gang." "What about them?" "They're part of a bigger operation than we realized. Working for someone with connections, political connections. The territorial governor's office is sending men to transport them to Denver for trial." Thomas frowned. "Sounds like you're handling it properly." "That's not what concerns me," Cole said, unlocking his office door. "Found this in Harker's possessions." He handed Thomas a folded piece of paper. Opening it, Thomas saw it was a list of names, ranch owners and their properties north of Pine Ridge. But what made his blood run cold was the name at the bottom. Northwood B. Schoolmistress. "Why would they have Beatrice's name?" Thomas asked sharply. "Don't know," Cole admitted, "but I don't like it. Harker's been asking questions about her since we brought him in. Wanted to know where she lived, her routine." "Have you told her?" "Thought you might want to. Seemed like you two were getting friendly." There was no innuendo in Cole's tone, just practical frontier directness. Thomas nodded grimly. "I'll speak with her." He found Beatrice still at the church, helping the minister's wife pack away the special decorations used for the Christmas service. When she saw his expression, her smile faded. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Can we speak privately?" They walked to the schoolhouse, which was empty on the holiday. Inside, Thomas showed her the list and explained what Cole had told him. "I don't understand," she said, her face pale. "I've never heard of this man Harker. Why would he have my name? Is there anything from your past that might connect you to him? Any reason someone from Denver might be interested in you?" She shook her head, bewildered. "No. I lived my whole life in Chicago until coming here. I've never even been to Denver." "What about your family?" "Your parents?" "My father was a professor of literature. My mother taught music from our home. They were ordinary people, Thomas." He paced the schoolroom, thinking. "Cole says Harker will be transported to Denver in 2 days. Until then, you should stay somewhere safe. Not the boarding house, too many people coming and going." "You think I'm in danger?" "I think there's something we don't understand yet. Better to be cautious." He considered the options. The ranch where I work is 15 miles out of town. Barton and his wife are good people. They'd give you a place to stay until this is sorted out. Beatrice looked around the schoolroom, at the small Christmas tree the children had decorated, at her desk with its neat stacks of papers. Leave my home because of a name on a list. It seems excessive. Please, Thomas said, the intensity of his concern surprising them both. Just for a few days. She studied his face, then nodded slowly. All right. When do we leave? As soon as you can pack what you need. An hour later they rode out of Pine Ridge, Beatrice on a gentle mare borrowed from the livery stable, a small valise tied behind her saddle. The day was clear but cold, the recent snowfall making the landscape blindingly bright under the winter sun. Thomas kept a vigilant eye on their surroundings as they traveled, scanning the rolling hills and scattered pine groves for any sign of movement. But the countryside remained peaceful, the only sounds their horses' hooves crunching through snow and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. It's beautiful out here, Beatrice said as they crested a rise that offered a view of the distant mountains. I've never been this far from town before. Thomas glanced at her, struck by how at ease she seemed in the saddle despite her city upbringing. You ride well. My father believed in a well-rounded education for his daughters. Riding lessons were part of that. She smiled at a memory. He said a woman should always be able to leave under her own power if necessary. Wise man. They rode in comfortable silence for a while until Beatrice asked, What will you do when spring comes? Move on as usual. The question stirred something in Thomas, an awareness that his pattern of constant movement had begun to feel less like freedom and more like running. Haven't decided, he answered truthfully. Barton's offered me a permanent position, foreman eventually if I stay. You should consider it, she said. You've made connections here whether you intended to or not. Before he could respond, his attention was caught by movement in a grove of trees ahead. He raised his hand, signaling Beatrice to stop. What is it? She whispered. Not sure, stay here. He dismounted, handing her his reins, and moved forward cautiously, his hand on his revolver. As he approached the trees, a figure emerged, a young Shoshone woman, perhaps 16 or 17, dressed in a mixture of native clothing and cast-off settler garments. She held a small rabbit, freshly caught. Hello, Thomas called, keeping his hands visible. You're on Barton land, but you're welcome to hunt here. The girl regarded him warily but didn't flee. No Barton, she said in accented English. Good man. Fair. Beatrice had ridden up beside Thomas, curiosity overcoming caution. Hello, she greeted the girl warmly. The Shoshone girl's eyes widened as she looked at Beatrice. She said something rapid in her own language, then switched to English. You, woman from school. Yes, Beatrice replied, surprised. Do you know me? See you in town, men ask about you. The girl made a gesture encompassing her own face. Show your picture. Thomas tensed. When was this? What men? 3 days ago, men with good horses, city clothes, ask where schoolteacher lives if she alone. The girl clutched her rabbit tighter. I not tell, don't trust. They offer money, but eyes are bad. Thomas and Beatrice exchanged alarmed glances. Thank you for telling us, Beatrice said. What's your name? Willow, the girl replied. Live with grandmother near creek, she pointed eastward. Should go now, men looking for you. Bad men. With that warning, she disappeared back into the trees, moving silently despite the snow. We need to move faster, Thomas said, helping Beatrice back onto her horse. If Harker's men were asking about you 3 days ago, they might already be watching the ranch. They continued their journey at a quicker pace, taking a less direct route that kept them under the cover of trees when possible. Thomas's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Why would professional rustlers from Denver be interested in a schoolteacher from Chicago? What possible connection could exist? As they approached the Barton ranch, Thomas became increasingly uneasy. The sprawling log ranch house sat in a valley, with the barn and corrals arranged nearby. Usually there would be activity visible, ranch hands tending livestock, smoke from the chimney. But the place looked unnaturally still. Something's wrong, he murmured, drawing his horse to a stop in a stand of pines that overlooked the ranch. Wait here. Thomas. Please, he said firmly. If there's trouble, ride back toward town. Get to Sheriff Cole. Reluctantly, she agreed. Thomas dismounted, drew his revolver, and moved cautiously down the slope toward the ranch house. The front door of the house stood partially open, wrong for the cold weather. Thomas approached from the side, keeping low, listening intently. No sounds came from within. He peered through a window and saw signs of a struggle: an overturned chair, a broken lamp. Heart pounding, he made his way to the barn. Inside, he found Barton and two ranch hands tied up, gagged, and secured to support posts. Their eyes widened when they saw him. Thomas quickly removed their gags and began cutting their bonds. 3 men, Barton gasped as soon as he could speak. Jumped us this morning, said they were waiting for you and a woman. My wife, Thomas asked urgently, the cook. Locked in the root cellar, one of the hands answered. They didn't hurt the women, just wanted them out of the way. Where are they now? 2 went to watch the road from the lookout ridge, Barton said, rubbing his wrists where the ropes had cut into them. 1 stayed to guard us, but went to check the perimeter about half an hour ago. Thomas made a quick decision. I need to get Miss Northwood away from here. Can you handle things if the guards come back? Barton nodded grimly, taking a rifle down from its rack on the wall. Go, we'll take care of ourselves now we're warned. Thomas slipped out of the barn and made his way back up the slope to where Beatrice waited, quickly explaining the situation. But why? She asked, confusion and fear evident in her voice. What do they want with me? I don't know, Thomas admitted, but we need to find somewhere safe until we figure it out. He considered their options. They couldn't go back to town. It would be the first place Harker's men would look. They needed a place to hide that only locals would know about. The old Mackenzie cabin, he decided. It's abandoned up in the foothills. Hunters use it occasionally, but most people have forgotten it exists. As they set off toward the mountains, the winter sun was already beginning its early descent. They would need to reach the cabin before dark, as navigating the narrow trails in moonlight would be treacherous. Thomas led them on a circuitous route, avoiding open spaces where they might be spotted. Twice they heard distant hoofbeats and concealed themselves in dense pine groves until the sounds faded. The old cabin came into view just as twilight was settling over the landscape. It was a simple one-room structure built of logs, with a stone chimney and a single window. It had been constructed by one of the first settlers in the area, a trapper named Mackenzie who had died years before, leaving the cabin to slowly decay. It's not much, Thomas said as he helped Beatrice dismount, but it's solid enough and no one will think to look for us here. Inside, the cabin was dusty but intact. A rough-hewn table and bench stood against one wall, a stone fireplace dominated another, and a narrow cot with a straw-filled mattress occupied a corner. Thomas quickly got a fire going using the dry wood stacked beside the hearth. As warmth began to fill the small space, Beatrice removed her coat and gloves, looking around at their temporary refuge. I feel like we've stepped back in time, she observed. Like we're the first settlers all over again. Thomas smiled faintly as he arranged their meager supplies, jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags, a canteen of water, a couple of blankets. Mackenzie lived here for 20 years, completely alone. Used to come into town once a season to trade furs. Sounds lonely, Beatrice said, sitting on the bench. Some people prefer solitude. And some people hide in it, she countered gently. Their eyes met across the cabin, the firelight creating dancing shadows on the log walls. Thomas felt an unexpected vulnerability, as though she could see past the careful barriers he'd constructed over years of frontier life. We should rest, he said, changing the subject. Tomorrow we'll need to figure out our next move. You take the cot, she insisted. I'll be fine on the bench with the blankets. Thomas shook his head. I'll keep watch by the fire. We don't know if they're still looking for us. They compromised by arranging the blankets on the floor near the hearth, where both could benefit from the warmth. As night settled fully outside, the cabin became a small island of light and heat in the vast darkness of the wilderness. Lying near the fire, wrapped in blankets, Beatrice turned toward Thomas, who sat with his back against the wall, his revolver beside him. I've been thinking about why these men might be after me, she said. The only thing I can imagine is that it has something to do with my father's papers. Thomas looked at her with renewed interest. What papers? After my family died, I found a locked box in my father's study. It contained documents, financial records, correspondence with people I'd never heard of. Some of it involved investments in mining operations in Colorado. "Did you bring these papers with you to Pine Ridge?" She nodded. "They're in a compartment beneath my trunk at the boarding house. I never looked at them closely, it was too painful after his death, and I didn't understand most of it anyway." Thomas's mind raced. Mining investments in Colorado. And Harker comes from Denver, there could be a connection. But how would they know about the papers, or that I had them? Someone must have known your father had them. Perhaps they've been looking for them since his death. Beatrice sat up, hugging her knees to her chest. "My father was an honest man. He wouldn't have been involved in anything illegal." "Not knowingly," Thomas agreed. "But mining ventures out west are complicated. There's a lot of money involved, and not everyone plays by the rules." They fell silent, considering the implications. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling around the cabin's eaves and sending occasional gusts down the chimney that made the fire flicker wildly. "Try to sleep," Thomas said finally. "We'll head back to town at first light. Need to get to those papers before Harker's men do." Beatrice lay down again, but her mind was too full for rest. After a few minutes she spoke again, her voice soft in the firelit darkness. "When you saw me freeze during the Christmas Carol performance, what did you understand?" The question caught Thomas off guard. "I recognized grief," he said slowly, "the kind that ambushes you when you least expect it." "Is that all?" He considered his answer carefully. "I understood that you, like me, were living behind a wall, presenting one face to the world while keeping another hidden." Her silence told him he'd spoken truly. "When Belle talks about being replaced in Scrooge's heart by a golden idol," she finally said, "it reminded me of my fiancé in Chicago. After my family died, he changed, became impatient with my grief, said I needed to put it behind me so we could move forward with our lives. When I wouldn't, he broke our engagement." "I'm sorry," Thomas said quietly. "Don't be," he showed his true nature when tested. She turned to look at him in the flickering light. "Not everyone does." Something shifted between them in that moment. A recognition, perhaps, that they had each found someone who understood the language of loss without translation. Thomas found himself sharing what he rarely spoke of. "After the war, I couldn't settle anywhere, kept moving west, taking work where I could find it, told myself it was freedom, but really I was just running from memories, from the possibility of losing someone else." "And now," she asked softly. "Now I'm not sure anymore," he admitted. "The old certainties don't seem so certain." Morning came with a fresh snowfall that had blanketed the landscape overnight, turning the forest into a pristine wonderland of white. They set out early, Thomas leading them down a different trail than the one they'd ascended, alert for any sign of pursuit. The town appeared peaceful as they approached, smoke rising from chimneys into the clear winter sky. Thomas led them directly to the sheriff's office, where they found Cole at his desk, looking grim. "Been looking for you too," he said as they entered. "We've got trouble." "Harker's men?" Thomas asked. Cole nodded. "Tried to break him out last night. Didn't succeed, but one of my deputies was shot, not fatal, thankfully." He eyed Beatrice. "They were asking all over town about you, Miss Northwood. What's your connection to these men?" Beatrice explained her theory about her father's papers. As she spoke, Cole's expression grew increasingly troubled. "Mining investments in Colorado territory can be complicated business," he said when she finished. "Lots of money changing hands, not always legally. If your father had documentation of something shady." "We need to get those papers," Thomas said, "before Harker's men do." Cole stood, checking his revolver. "I'll come with you to the boarding house. My deputy's watching Harker, and the federal marshals should arrive by evening to take him to Denver." The three of them walked quickly to Mother Crawford's boarding house, which appeared undisturbed. The landlady was shocked to hear about the danger, but quickly led them to Beatrice's room on the second floor. The room was small but neat, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a wooden trunk at the foot of the bed. Beatrice knelt beside the trunk and worked a hidden mechanism that released a false bottom. From the concealed compartment, she withdrew a leather portfolio tied with string. "These are all of my father's papers," she said, placing them on the bed. The three of them began sorting through the documents, financial ledgers, letters on official stationery, legal contracts with terms that made little sense to Beatrice. "Here," Cole said suddenly, holding up a sheet of paper. "This could be it." The document was a list of investors in something called the Black Eagle Mining Company, with amounts noted beside each name. Several of the names had been marked with a red asterisk. Black Eagle was involved in a scandal last year, Cole explained. Claimed to have found a rich silver vein near Denver, sold shares to investors, then suddenly announced the vein had played out. A lot of people lost money. He tapped the paper. These marked names, they might be investors who were defrauded. My father was keeping evidence, Beatrice realized. But why? He wasn't an investor himself. Thomas studied another document, a letter on the mining company's letterhead. According to this, your father was approached to evaluate the company's financial prospects for some Eastern investors. He must have discovered the fraud. And someone knew he had proof, Cole added. Someone connected to Harker. A sudden commotion from downstairs interrupted them, shouting, then a gunshot. Cole drew his weapon, moving toward the door. "Stay here," he ordered, but before he could leave the room, heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs. The door burst open, revealing two men with revolvers. One had Harker's dark beard from his wanted poster, James Harker himself, somehow freed from jail. The other was unfamiliar, but his expensive suit and confident bearing marked him as someone used to authority. "Miss Northwood," the well-dressed man said smoothly, "at last we meet. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Cole had his gun trained on the intruders, but with two weapons pointed at him, the standoff was precarious. "Drop your weapons," he ordered. "You're under arrest." Harker laughed. "Your deputy's taking a nap in the cell I vacated, Sheriff, and the landlady's locked in her pantry. No one's coming to help you." "What do you want?" Beatrice asked, her voice steadier than Thomas would have expected. "The papers," the well-dressed man replied. "All of them. Your father was a clever man, Miss Northwood, but he should have minded his own business. Those documents could ruin several prominent men, myself included." "You're Clayton Hurst," Cole said suddenly, "owner of Black Eagle Mining." "And future territorial senator," Hurst confirmed with a cold smile. "Unless those papers find their way to Denver." Thomas had been slowly shifting his position, moving incrementally toward where his coat lay across the bed, his revolver in its pocket. Hurst noticed the movement and swung his weapon toward Thomas. "Don't be foolish, cowboy. I have no quarrel with you unless you make one." In that moment of distraction, Beatrice acted. She swept the papers from the bed, scattering them toward the open window where winter air was stirring the curtains. Several sheets caught the breeze and flew outside. "No!" Hurst shouted, lunging forward. The room erupted into chaos. Cole fired at Harker, who returned fire. Thomas dove for his weapon, rolling across the floor as bullets splintered the wooden bed frame above him. Beatrice pressed herself against the wall, clutching the portfolio that contained the remaining documents. When the gunsmoke cleared, Harker lay motionless by the door, a bullet in his chest. Cole was down, clutching his shoulder where Harker's shot had caught him. Hurst stood in the center of the room, his gun now trained on Beatrice. "The papers," he demanded. "Now." Thomas rose slowly from behind the bed, his revolver aimed at Hurst. "It's over, Hurst. Drop the gun." "You don't understand what's at stake here," Hurst said, his composure cracking. "Those papers will destroy everything I've built." "Because you built it on fraud," Beatrice said. "On stealing from people who trusted you." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, with surprising speed for a man of his size, Hurst lunged toward Beatrice. Thomas fired, his bullet catching Hurst in the arm. The businessman stumbled, his own weapon discharging into the ceiling before collapsing to his knees. Thomas quickly secured Hurst's gun, then checked on Cole, whose wound was painful but not life-threatening. By the time the townspeople, alerted by the gunfire, arrived at the boarding house, the situation was under control. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. The federal marshals arrived and took charge of Hurst and the wounded Harker. Beatrice's father's papers were officially documented and sent to Denver as evidence. Sheriff Cole, his arm in a sling, received commendations from the territorial governor's office for breaking up what turned out to be a significant criminal enterprise. Through it all, Thomas remained at Beatrice's side, something neither of them commented on but both seemed to accept as natural. They fell into an easy rhythm, taking meals together at the hotel restaurant, walking through town in the crisp winter air, talking for hours about everything and nothing. A week after the confrontation at the boarding house, Thomas found Beatrice at the schoolhouse, preparing lessons for the new term that would begin after New Year's Day. Snow fell gently outside the windows as afternoon faded toward evening. "Sheriff Cole received a telegram from Denver," he said as he hung his coat on the rack by the door. "The territorial prosecutor says they have more than enough evidence to convict Hurst and his associates. Your father's papers were the missing piece they needed." Beatrice looked up from her work, a smile lighting her face. He would have been pleased to know that justice was done. He believed in that one person could make a difference by standing for truth. Thomas sat on the edge of her desk, studying her face in the warm glow of the oil lamp. The events of the past weeks had changed her, or perhaps merely revealed what had been hidden beneath grief and caution. There was a quiet strength in her now, a certainty that hadn't been there before. "You're a lot like him, I think," Thomas said. She closed her lesson book and met his eyes. "What about you, Thomas? Barton told me he's still holding that foreman position for you. Will you take it?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Thomas had been asking himself the same thing for days, examining the comfortable patterns of his solitary existence against the unexpected pull he felt toward this place, these people toward her. "I've been thinking about what you said at the cabin," he replied, "about hiding in solitude rather than choosing it. And you were right, I've been running for a long time, telling myself I was free when really I was just afraid." "Afraid of what?" she asked softly, though her eyes suggested she already knew. "Of caring about something, someone, and losing them, of building something that could be taken away." He took a deep breath. "The frontier is harsh, that much is true, but facing it alone. That was my choice, not a necessity." Beatrice rose from her chair, moving to stand before him. "And now?" Thomas reached for her hands, taking them gently in his own. "Now I think I'd like to try facing it differently, with roots. With connections," he paused, gathering courage. "With you if you're willing." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. "I am willing, Thomas, more than willing." He drew her closer, one hand moving to touch her cheek. "I saw you freeze during that Christmas carol," he said softly, "and understood too much about pain and loss. But now I think I understand something else too." "What's that?" she whispered. "That sometimes the greatest courage isn't in facing danger or surviving alone. It's in opening yourself to love, knowing it might bring pain, but choosing it anyway." As the snow fell outside and lamplight cast their shadows against the schoolroom walls, Thomas lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after years of wandering. In that moment, all the false beliefs about isolation and protection fell away, replaced by a simpler truth, that love, even on the harsh frontier, was worth the risk. By spring, Thomas had accepted the foreman position at the Barton Ranch, moving into a small cabin on the property that he spent his free days expanding and improving. Beatrice continued teaching at the schoolhouse, her classes growing as more families moved to the area. They were married on a clear May morning, with wildflowers blooming across the prairie and the distant mountains still capped with snow. The entire town turned out for the celebration, from Sheriff Cole, his arm fully healed, to Mother Crawford, who wept happily through the ceremony. That evening, as they stood on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Beatrice leaned against Thomas's shoulder. "My father used to say that true happiness isn't the absence of storms, but finding someone to weather them with you," she said. Thomas wrapped his arm around her waist, drawing her closer. "Wise man, your father." "He would have liked you," she replied, then laughed softly, "though he might have been concerned about your initial aversion to Christmas carols." Thomas smiled, remembering the night months ago when everything had changed, when he'd seen her freeze on stage and recognized a kindred spirit. "I'm developing a fondness for them, particularly when sung by a certain schoolteacher." As darkness settled over the frontier land they both now called home, Thomas Landon reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from solitary wanderer to a man with roots, responsibilities, and most importantly, love. The West was still wild, still dangerous, still unpredictable, but facing it together made all the difference. For the first time since leaving the battlefields of the Civil War, Thomas felt truly at peace. The river of grief still flowed through his life, as it did through Beatrice's, but they had indeed learned to live alongside it, to build something beautiful on its shores. And when Christmas came again, bringing with it memories both painful and precious, they would face it together, understanding too much about loss, perhaps, but even more about love.